So, Jack, we spoke about your views in epistemology the other day, and then you said for part of it that you'd go a bit further. So we were talking about companions and guilt yesterday, and we got the discussion to epistemic facts, and you said that you believe, or like rather epistemic reasons or norms, and you said the only norm that you think exists is something like believe what is true, right, or likely to be true, right?
Yeah, believe what um yeah, one ought to believe what one has reason to believe is likely true, something like that.
I see. So, what's your justification for that belief? What would that be?
That those are the only epistemic reasons.
Okay, I see. Right.
Well, I'm asking what belief are you asking? That's
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the only epistemic reason. Yeah. I wasn't sure if you just presented an argument for your belief or if you were asking a question there. Um, yeah, I was asking like, what's your like argument or your belief for the existence of this this epistemic norm, or if it even is categorical.
well, I wouldn't say it's categorical.
Okay.
I think it might be a universal norm because I think um it might be a commitment that's constitutive of agency, that one ought to believe things that are one judges to likely be true, at least all else equal, because there might be competing reasons not to believe those things.
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to plug in my battery because my phone is about to die.
All right, Jack. Plug in your battery.
And actually, let me switch this to voice activity.
Oh, okay. Ugh.
Ah, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Um, I don't remember what the last thing I said was.
Sorry, you don't know what?
I don't remember what the last thing I said was.
Oh, I was asking why you think that categorical norms. Sorry, whether or not you think that you should believe what is likely to be true is categorical or something. You said it's not categorical; it's universal, and then
Yeah, so I think it probably is a constitutive feature of agency that
okay,
one has reason or one has a commitment to um, believing what is likely to be true, what one judges to be likely
and
to be true,
that's like an inherent like predicate of being of like existing in your view
of being an agent.
of being an agent. Okay,
Yeah. Because what an agent is somebody who has aims and desires that potentially rationalize actions, right?
Right.
Um, and so, given that, so the idea is, I guess you might say that the desire to do X affords you a reason to do X. And so, in virtue of having a reason to do X, one has a reason to um, do, one has a reason to be aware of what conduces to X or to the realization of any image that one. And it seems like knowing the facts are a way to do, conduce to doing. But I'm not really sure a lot really turns on the idea that actually there's a couple of considerations. So that's one consideration, right? That maybe one has a commitment in virtue of the fact that knowing what's true conduces to realizing one's aims, right? Um, that's one consideration.
Yeah.
Another consideration is that I think you could argue that beliefs are truth aimed states, right? That they're constitutively truth aimed. So a belief is just something that's aiming at what's true. And if that's the case, right, then that's going to be a norm that's built into believing at all, right? But I think the third point is that I'm not sure any of it really matters. Let's say you had some good reason to resist looking at it that way. Um, well, then I think you would just be saying that um, one ought to believe what's likely to be true if one values truth, right? You still have a hypothetical norm. It just might not be a universal one. Um, and so then the things that might be called, I mean, I'm not really sure what epistemologists or, proponents of the companions in guilt argument exactly have in mind when they talk about epistemic norms. That if they think um, one ought to believe when given a, let's say they think there's a norm like this. I'm not sure that this is what they have in mind. But let's say they think there's a norm like this. One ought to prefer a more parsimonious theory to a less parsimonious one, all else equal. Mm, well, why? Right? Well, it seems like they could just say there's no further reason, right? But that doesn't sound like a very convincing reason to. I mean, I wouldn't, if I didn't already accept the principle of parsimony, I wouldn't accept a justification like that, right? So presumably, what they could say is that that the reason is because more parsimonious theories are more likely to be true, right? Okay, and so then you could ask, well, why should I believe things that are more likely to be true, right? And if you didn't accept that there was either a norm built into agency itself or that beliefs already that the class of intentional states that we call beliefs are already constitutively truth aimed. If you rejected that picture, right, then the answer would be because you value truth. Now, it might be that you value truth. I suppose people could have different reasons for valuing truth, right? Um, but if there weren't a value for truth, then I'm not sure. If you didn't value truth, then I'm not sure why you ought to accept the principle of parsimony, right? But it seems like the norm in question is that you ought to believe true things, right? And that's a norm that is either like basic, you just care about the truth for its own sake, or it's in the service of some other norm, right? Like, so maybe believing true things conduces to realizing one's aims. So that's why truth is valuable, right? But either way, it seems like the relevant norm is believing things that you judge to likely be true, right? And then these other things that epistemologists might be calling epistemic norms, like the norm of accepting a more parsimonious theory when faced with the choice two competing theories, right? That doesn't look like a norm at all, right? This looks like a descriptive fact, right? That that it just is the case, regardless of what your values are, right? That parsimonious theories are more likely to be true, right? Assuming that, because there's an argument for that, right? Which is that if you have fewer propositions, that two theories, if you have two theories and one contains more propositions than the other, but the propositions have equal credence, then all else equal, the one with fewer propositions is more likely to be true because you're less likely to have gotten something wrong because there are fewer propositions to get wrong, right? That's sort of, I think that's how you would justify the principle of parsimony. But there doesn't seem to be anything normative there. Okay? There's no ought there. Saying something is more likely to be true doesn't contain any ought in it. Saying something is more likely to be true in virtue of facts XYZ doesn't contain any ought. So I don't know what they think these norms are, really. It's not clear to me why I would think of that as a norm. I mean, somebody might have the norm that one ought to believe. Somebody might have the value, right, that one ought to believe more parsimonious theories, right? But why ought somebody else have it, right? It's hard to see what they could appeal to other than that it conduces to the truth. And if you care about the truth, then you should select beliefs that are in accord with that principle, all else equal.
Yeah. So now I'm curious if you also have time to explain. So you reject phenomenal conservatism, right?
Uh-huh.
Why is that? And like, what kind of beliefs do you what kind of justifications are there? Do you think for beliefs outside of like direct inferential ones? And if not, like, how do our, you know, like, I guess, like, base desires or base, like, reasons, like, come about?
Yeah, so I don't think I think there's any such thing as justification
Oh,
that
I see.
is non that is non-inferential.
Okay.
So I just take justification and inference to be synonymous, I guess. Now, I think given that that's sort of how I understand the concept, I'm not even sure I have a substantive disagreement with proponents of phenomenal conservatism in the sense that when they say you have a reason to believe X, just in virtue of it seeming to be true, right? That just sounds like they're using reason in a sense that um, I don't recognize. So then you might ask, well, what are these things, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not talking about inferences. Um, so how is there a justification? They just seem like when they say justification, it seems like they're just using a word to mean something else. Um, so um, there's a couple of considerations that might be raised in this connection. Um, One is that they might want to claim, well, there's a few points. They might want to claim that there's this broader notion of justification, which inferential justification is a species of. And so non inferential justification is like um, some uh, some other subset of that class, that broader class of justifications, right? Because presumably, I think they probably would want to claim that. But I just don't recognize what that is, so I don't know what's being talked about there. And I think if they're asked, I think if they're asked, um, they will just appeal to a semantic premise, right? And since I don't possess the concept, that's more or less the end of the conversation. Now, personally, I think that I'm just skeptical that there is a concept there that has any real intelligibility. Um, in the same way that I'm skeptical that there's a concept uh, of a categorical norm, in the sense that Mackey talks about, or well, that's also called like an external normative reason by Parfit and so on. I think that's probably what Lance Bush is trying to get at, maybe when he uses the term stance independent norms. I'm not entirely clear. I mean, it's interesting that he uses that language because he's trying to presumably pick out something that they think they're picking out, which he claims not to understand. Right? So it's not even. I mean, maybe he got the term from somebody else. I don't know. But anyway, I don't know what people are talking about when they talk about those things, and I actually am doubtful that there is such a concept there. I think it's probably just a bunch of gibberish. People are confused. But can't necessarily prove that. Although a couple of friends of mine, this sort of came up. This issue has come up before, and I think they did actually develop an argument to disprove phenomenal conservatism. And I think that it probably was convincing, but I've sort of forgotten that. So I'll have to talk to them about it at some point and see if they can reconstruct it, because then maybe I could make a stronger claim, right? Which it's provably false that there are these so-called reasons to believe whatever is that's meant to be. It's a little bit puzzling because it seems like it's a little bit hard for me to understand what the thesis is, because it's kind of like, well, if what the phenomenal conservatism, what the proponent of the phenomenal conservatism says is, I think what they say is, you have reason to believe X if X seems to be true in the absence of a defeater. I think that's the basic idea, right? Now, if it's an epistemic reason, is it an epistemic reason in virtue of the fact that it increases the probability of the belief being true? The fact that it seems to be true in the absence of a defeater? Well, if that's the reason, then it seems like if it were true that beliefs that were likely to be true were that beliefs that seemed to be true were more likely to be true in the absence of a defeater. If that were a true generalization, then you could just appeal to the fact that given that that's true, that there would be an inferential reason, right? So it's hard to see how they're not saying that, right? In which case, what is this talk about non-inferential justification? So then there's a couple points that come into view, given that kind of question, right? Because you might want to ask, what justifies the belief that that something that seems to be true is likely to be true if there's no defeater? Is more likely to be true than not if there's no defeater, right? And so, what are they going to appeal to justify that, right? They don't want to argue in a circle by saying, well, that seems to be true, right? That seems like that would be some type of illicit circular reasoning. So, so then maybe they could give an argument as to why, but then it seems to me you'd be in the grip of inferential justification there, right? Now, if they weren't saying that it was that you ought to believe what seems to be true in virtue, you ought to believe what seems to be true in the absence of a defeater. If they aren't saying that that's an epistemic reason to believe, right, then they're talking about some other kind of reason. And so then what kind of reason are they talking about? Now, I think maybe they might be talking about a pragmatic reason, because I think one of the standard arguments in support of phenomenal conservatism is that rejecting it is self-defeating, right? So I think Michael Huemer has an argument like that. Now, I don't exactly remember. I mean, I remember the basic idea behind the argument is something like, when you think the idea is something like when you you rely on an inference, ultimately you're relying on some seemings. And so there's just no getting away from just relying on seemings, right? Now, it's been a long time since I've looked at that argument, but I remember at one point
Yeah,
I
and I
thought
mean,
that it was,
I guess the other question is like, what epistemic reason do we have to believe the like methodologies or the logic that we use to make those inferences?
yeah, but I would not, I do not think it makes sense to say
Oh,
that, um, that those kinds of things could be justified. Um, because I think all I understand justification to be is the deployment of those kinds of rules of inference in the various types of inferential reasoning that we engage in. You know, abductive, inductive, deductive, maybe decision theoretic, analogical, and so on. Right. So, what would it mean for there to be some further justification for those? Right. Um, but as I recall, I used to think Humer's argument was um, persuasive. This was quite a long time ago. Well, maybe like around 2011. I think I encountered that argument. I thought this seems like a good argument. But then within a year or two after that, I reconsidered it and I thought it's just some kind of question begging argument. Now, unfortunately, I can't really remember how I came to that conclusion. So I'd have to go back and look at Humer's argument again, see if I could reconstruct why I ended up deciding it was a bad argument. So I can't really
it
address
was
the
this like
argument.
his initial argument for phenomenal conservatism, like the first paper that he
Yeah,
made. Okay, I read that paper, but I don't remember the argument. But I
yeah,
think like part of it is basically that it accounts for the majority of our beliefs, like because most of our beliefs, in his argument, is that well, but basically he says that a lot of our beliefs aren't inferential beliefs. In fact, very few are, and the majority of our beliefs, in order for them to be justified, it's okay to rely on seemings. And he says it's like a good case in foundationalism as well. I think that's what I remember from the
yeah,
paper. I didn't read it recently either.
yeah. But in any case, uh, I think if you're if you're if you're saying it's not a it sounds like to say that rejecting phenomenal conservatism is self-defeating, right? Which I guess I don't believe is the case. But like to like address his argument, I'd have to go back and look at it again. Um, but let's just say that they are appealing to that reason, right? Well, is that an epistemic reason to be a phenomenal conservative? A proponent of is that a reason to accept phenomenal conservatism? That sounds like a pragmatic reason
Yeah, that's why I
to
was drawing
me.
towards it.
Yeah. Um, in which case we're not in the realm of epistemic reasons at all, you know. Of course I think it probably would be a serious problem if I think it could be a serious problem if you thought that rejecting phenomenal conservatism was self-defeating, right? I suppose that does sound like that would be a big problem. So if I was convinced that it would be, I'd have to. If there was a good argument to show that, then I'd have to either accept phenomenal conservatism or find a way to attack that argument. You know, um, but um, I do think that But in any case, I don't know what kind of reason they're talking about. Um, if it's a pragmatic reason, then maybe there is a pragmatic reason to. Maybe you have pragmatic reasons to believe things that seem to be true. Um, Look, I could grant for the sake of argument that you have pragmatic reasons to believe what seems to be true in the absence of a defeater. Right? Maybe there's some argument that that's uh, going to conduce to certain aims that an agent is likely to have, right? But it's just a non-epistemic consider. It just sounds like a non-epistemic consideration,
Right.
right? And I thought the whole point of phenomenal conservatism is that you're supposed to have epistemic reason. Because when I ask somebody, why do I, somebody says,
That's a very good critique, actually, which I never thought about. Wow.
yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
if somebody says, if I ask somebody says, I believe X, right? And I say, well, why do you believe that, right? Um, they might say, oh well, because it seems to be true, and I don't have a defeater for it, right? But if I were asking what explains why you believe it, right, that might be an answer to the question I'm asking. And if I were asking what kind of reasons do you appeal to because when I say explains, that might be understood as like causally explained, right? So sometimes we use why to mean what causally explains, right? So if I say uh, why uh, did that person die because a boulder fell on them, right? Um, and crushed them, right? Well, that's a causal explanation. Now, sometimes when we say why, we're actually looking for justification. We're looking for a reasons explanation in terms of reasons, not in terms of causes, right? Well, if somebody says, I believe in God because it seems to be true and I don't have the defeater for it, right? Well, if I were looking for an epistemic reason, it wouldn't be an answer to that question, right? Unless they could show me how the fact that it seems to be true is likely to the fact that it seems to be true in the absence of a defeater makes it the case that it's more likely to be true, right? And so when they appeal to a non-inferential epistemic reason, they aren't offering me that, and so they therefore aren't answering my question. If what I'm asking, if when I ask that question, as I usually am asking for, if what I'm asking for is an epistemic reason, now they could be offering me a pragmatic reason, and so I suppose if what I wanted to know is how are you justifying your adoption of this belief, right? They might offer me pragmatic reasons. They might say, oh well, I adopted this belief because I'm I understood I'd be a much happier person, right? Uh, by adopting it, So I sought a way to convince myself that it was true, you know, like Pascal's wager or something, right? Pascal sort of argues, um, you ought to believe in God because um, you you have a pragmatic reason to believe in God because believing in God might um, earn you rewards of infinite magnitude, right? And so you've got, it must be desirable to any rational person to earn rewards of infinite magnitude. And so even if you have very little reason to believe that it's likely to be true, you have enormous pragmatic reason to believe it's true. And so you ought to find a way to acquire that belief. And so he offers a recommendation, right? Just start going to church, go through all the um, motions that believers go through, pray at the altar, um, sing the hymns or whatever, right? Um, do all the things that believers do, and that will increase the likelihood that you acquire those beliefs, right? Which might be good advice, but it's not an answer. If somebody's saying, yeah, I have a pragmatic reason for believing things that seem to be true in the absence of a defeater, it's not an epistemic justification for me, right?
Right.
So, so I just am not even really clear on what phenomenal conservatism is supposed to be. And that might just be because I'm not well read in the literature on it, as I'm not, right?
Right.
I just sort of, like, you know, I sort of came across the idea because it's very commonplace, right, in philosophy, particularly in philosophy of religion, but in many other domains, in moral realists, typically robust realists about morals, typically appeal to it. So it's very important there, and it's very important in. It seems to be very important in philosophy of religion. Um, so one, if you do what I do, one constantly comes across it, right? Because I'm in these debate platforms, discussions about philosophy, particularly philosophy of religion and meta ethics. So one constantly encounters it, right? So you know when I first sort of started to consider it as a proposal, I thought it was persuasive because I thought Hume's argument was good, right? But I must have eventually thought that it just began to seem like an alibi for dogmatism, and thought, I ought to like reconsider whether Hume's argument really works. Now, as I don't actually recall how I concluded that it was a bad argument, but as I said, but um, but as I don't, it's sort of hard for me to understand what the thesis is even supposed to be, right? Because as I say, if it's affording an epistemic reason, it's hard to see why, right? And if it is a type of epistemic reason, and there's a way to justify that non-circularly, then it just seems like it's going to license an in, an in, an inferential justification, right? And so if it bottoms out an inferential justification, what the hell is uh, phenomenal conservatism in the first place, right? So it seems like it can't be that. But then if it's a non-inferential justification, I don't even know what's being talked about. I don't even understand what kind of reason it's supposed to be, because maybe it's not an epistemic reason. If it's a pragmatic reason, then it just seems like it's not um, even in the domain of epistemic. It's just an answer to a different question. When I ask, why do you believe that? If what I'm looking for is epistemic justification, and they say, oh, the reason why I believe this is because it's pragmatically justified by some further value that I have. Right. Well, then they're just not answering my question. So I don't even really understand what I'm supposed to be adopting. Now, I think I guess there's a couple other points about it. One point is that, I think I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. Um, give me a second. I had something in mind. I know the other thing that I wanted to say, but there was something I wanted to say before that. Let me just see if I can remember what it was. Um, well, maybe it'll come back to me. I'll say the other thing I was talking about, and maybe it'll come back to me. There is now there. I suppose. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I remember now. Yeah, the other thing I was going to say was I really don't understand how there's something that seems like kind of illicit about the way it's deployed. Um,
What, phenomenal conservatism?
yeah, because I guess I feel like um, I feel like it's in some ways a conversation starter. Because it's kind of like um, uh, if I say what's the epistemic reason to believe this, and they say, oh well, because it seems to be true. Um, to me, right? Well, if it doesn't seem to be true to me, right, uh, that's not really going to be very helpful, right? Maybe you do, let's say for the sake of argument, because again, I'm not totally unclear on what is even going on. People appeal to these seemings as justifiers, right, in some non-inferential way. Um, uh, if they might be hoping that it seems to be true to me, and that therefore they can say, well, it's a reason for you too, right? Now, obviously, if I'm not somebody who thinks seemings non-inferentially justify whatever that means, then them saying that isn't going to have any value unless they can convince me to become a phenomenal proponent, somebody who accepts phenomenal conservatism. Um, but in the absence of an argument like that, then all they're really doing is, in some way that's completely inscrutable to me, presumably saying that they're afforded some kind of epistemic justification that I can't understand. So I just kind of feel like, well, if my intuitions go the other way, we're at a stalemate, right? Even if I were a proponent of phenomenal conservatism, and then we're just going to have to appeal to something else, right? So,
Yeah, but both could be. This isn't a rebuttal, more just a question. Like, both could be contradictory. Sorry, but both could be contradictory and yet justified, right? Like two different beliefs.
yeah, I'm just saying, like, if they say, well, it seems true to me, and I say it seems true to me, where do we go from there? Do we like poll the majority of people and see, do we poll as many people as we can? And if the majority have the intuitions going one way, is that supposed to move me? That fact that something is intuitive to more people than what I find intuitive? Are they committed to something like that? I'm not even really clear whether that's part of the thesis. That we should think that whatever the majority intuition is truth favoring, right? It's hard to see how they aren't committed to that, because if they're saying it affords some kind of epistemic justification, um, then and it does it for you, right? Why wouldn't that fact carry some weight? Why wouldn't it carry more weight that more people share your intuition than share mine if I have a contrary, right? So I don't know. Um, it just seems like a bunch of nonsense. The only other thing that I wanted to say, at least that comes to mind now, is that I guess there is a way in which maybe I do understand reasons as non-inferential in certain contexts. So, but I don't think that that's going to be of any use to the proponent of phenomenal conservatism. So what I'm thinking of is something like this, right? Um, I look at a piece of cake and I perceive its desirability. Um, so what the very perception of its desirability does afford a reason to eat the cake, right? Because the desirability of the cake um, is what gives me reason to eat it. At least the belief, right, that I'm perceiving the desirability of the cake. Um, so I guess that's not really an inference. Um, it's kind of like, so there are value properties in the world, they're perceived, and in their perception, um, they uh, in their perception they afford reasons to do X or believe X. Right? Because you might have the belief that X is desirable, so you acquired that belief. Right? Somebody says, "Well, why do you think that's desirable?" Right? I might say, "Well, it just seemed that way." Right? But I, I, I don't know that I would say. I don't know that I would say exactly that that's a justification for the belief. Maybe I mean, that's a tricky question. I might just say, well, um, the seeming the seeming of its desirability is just constitutive of my desiring it, right? Because what it is for something to seem desirable is to desire it, right?
Yeah.
On my view, anyway. On my view, right? On my view, what it is for something to seem desirable is to desire it. So, in perceiving the desirability of something, one acquires a desire, right? What it is to perceive it as desirable is to desire it, right? In fact, desiring is constituted by those perceptions, at least at bottom. Because sometimes we desire things in virtue of other desires, right? Like I might desire to get a car, but I might want the car because I want to visit Alaska, right? And so I might have a perception of Alaska's desirability because maybe I was there and I thought this is a beautiful place, right? So it seemed like a very desirable place to be, right? And so I acquired this desire to get a car in virtue of my desire to go back to Alaska, right? But that desire for a car is instrumental to realizing a further desire, which bottoms out in some kind of perception of value, right? But I think probably all desires bottom out um, in these perceptions. The only exceptions might be maybe there are some desires that are constitutive of agency. Maybe those aren't actually acquired in virtue of a perception. Maybe maybe they just come for free with agency itself, right? So you sort of like a priori desires. So I'm not sure there's any kind of inference, right, and reasons when it comes to reasons to do things that are um, kind of like foundational uh, desires, if you think there are foundational desires. Because you could be a coherentist about desires, right? And maybe that's the correct picture. Um, so maybe all my desires are rationalized by other desires. Well, I guess it's going to be tricky how you. It seems like, yeah, I don't. I guess it's going to get a little bit thorny here because obviously we acquire new desires in virtue of perceptions. And so I guess they have to fit into the web if you're a coherentist about desires. But if you ask me to justify some belief, presumably all I can really do. Sorry, if you ask me to justify some desire, presumably all I can do is appeal to desires if I'm a coherentist about desires. Right? So I'm not sure I would take a strong stand on that. Until I've thought about it more. But anyway, so I think maybe there is some way in which you could talk about non-inferential reasons when it comes to perceptions of value, but I'm not really sure how that's supposed to work in the case of these non-inferential epistemic reasons. If that's even what proponents of phenomenal conservatism are talking about, because as I say, there's some. Well, my confusion about this might just be based on my ignorance of the literature on this. So maybe they've made themselves very clear on this point. But as I say, just based on my limited knowledge, I don't know whether they're talking about epistemic reasons, pragmatic reasons, or some other type of reason, in which case it seems to be some kind of semantic primitive that I'm not in possession of. But if it's an epistemic reason, as I say, I don't really understand why it's supposed to be one unless it increases likelihood. But then if it increases likelihood, it just seems to me we can just ask why the fact that something seems to be true, right, in the absence of defeater means it's more likely to be true. But if we had and it seems to me you could come up with a story like that, right? Like you could say, a theist might say, well, God designs you so that you're, in the general case, the fact that something seems to be true is more likely to be true. He's designed your cognitive faculties or perceptual faculties in a way, right? But then you'd have an inference. So then what's the non-inferential reason, right? What's a non-inferential epistemic reason, right? So I don't really understand. So it seems like if we're really concerned with epistemic reasons, what we're really talking about is what's probability raising. And if we're talking about what's probability raising, then it seems like there's a dilemma, right? Either the seeming that the proponent of phenomenal conservatism is talking about is, and maybe this is the argument that my friends came up with. I'll have to go back to them, because I seem to recall that they did sort of frame it as a kind of dilemma. Maybe this was the dilemma, right? Either it's probability raising, in which case there's an inference, or it's not probability raising, in which case it's not epistemic. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So you could take that to be kind of like a type of maybe a possible. I'm offering this tentatively because I might be misunderstanding something that proponents of this view have in mind. But tentatively, at least, that seems like a reductio of the position, right? It just founders on this dilemma, because either they're saying it's probability raising, in which case it affords an inferential justification, or it isn't probability raising, in which case it's not epistemic, or so it seems to me, right? Because that's how I'm understanding epistemic reasons, right? And that relates back to the stuff I was saying before, that really the only epistemic reason is that we ought to believe or at least what seems to me to be the case, is that we ought to believe what um, what is likely to be true, right? And in which case, all the other so-called epistemic norms, like the norm of um, accepting more parsimonious theories, bottom out in that more fundamental norm, which is the norm to believe things that are likely to be true, right? So I think that's a potential reductio against phenomenal conservatism. And of course, the other point about this is that it's hard to understand how they're supposed to justify it in the first place. I mean, humor does offer this argument, which I haven't really addressed, as I said, haven't addressed here, as I've said, that it's self-defeating to reject it. But that just seems to be an appeal to a pragmatic reason, which might be very significant, right? Because maybe it would be disastrous pragmatically, given the aims of most or all of us to not adopt this principle. But then we wouldn't have an epistemic justifier, right? Which is what I thought we were supposed to have.
Wait, I'm confused. Why wouldn't we?
Because they're just saying that it's they're just saying we have a pragmatic justifier.
Okay, and what's the difference?
Yeah. What's the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I take it that an epistemic justifier is what one has reason to believe in virtue of the fact that it is likely to be true, whereas a pragmatic justification is something we have reason to believe. Pragmatic justification for a belief is something we have reason to believe in virtue of some other value.
I see.
Right? Like the value of happiness. Like we have reasons to believe things because we might value our own happiness. Well, in fact, I guess the way that I understand happiness is that it would be probably impossible to not value it, not value one's own happiness. But just so let's just assume everybody values their own happiness. Then we might have reasons to believe things because they conduce to our happiness. But that doesn't mean that they're epistemic reasons, but they're pragmatic reasons to believe things. Right? So humor, it's not clear to me humor is offering an epistemic justification for phenomenal conservatism. Now, he might have a very good, a very strong pragmatic justification. Although, again, as I said, not really clear on what we would exactly be adopting, right? Other than that we have good pragmatic reason to believe what's likely to be true. We have good pragmatic reason to believe what seems to be true in the absence of a defeater, right? Because, that seems weird because, and this is just another point that just came to me, it seems sort of weird because it doesn't usually seem to be that easy to believe things just because we have pragmatic reason to believe them, right? It seems like you have to do a lot of work usually to believe something, right? Like that's sort of what Pascal's point is,
I was
right?
literally about to say the same thing. Like Pascal admitted as much.
Pascal is
Pascal's
saying,
I was
look,
literally thinking of that.
hopefully,
That's amazing.
hopefully, if you do this for years, right, go to church every day, hopefully, you will eventually acquire the belief. Right?
Yeah.
So it's hard to believe that humor could really think that we can just sort of acquire this belief just in virtue of recognizing its pragmatic value. Well, there was another. I was trying to get to something with that. Oh, right. And so the other issue besides the dilemma that I offered, which seems like a kind of reductio, is so I was asking, what is the epistemic justification for phenomenal conservatism? Right now, humor's argument seems like a pragmatic justifier at best, so we can ignore that. So what else are they going to appeal to? as seeming
Mm.
that it's true, right? Well, that would just be to argue in a circle, right? Um, and I don't see why anybody'd be interested in that. Um, so it doesn't really seem like they have. I mean, maybe there is an argument and some type of epistemic justification. But then, if there were an epistemic justification for phenomenal conservatism that wasn't an appeal to the fact that it seems to be a true thesis and there's no defeater for it, right? Assuming there is no defeater for it, right? Well, then they'd have an inferential justification for it. But then if they had an inferential justification, epistemic justification for phenomenal conservatism, then all seemings would afford an inferential justification for uh, for a belief. In which case, there'd be no non-inferential justification to speak of. So maybe that's another way of reframing the same argument, and that's a reductio of epistemic of phenomenal conservatism. So yeah, so I don't. Those reductios do seem pretty powerful to me. I mean, when I say the word seem, it's very hard to avoid the seeming talk, which is probably something that proponents of phenomenal conservatism are emboldened by. But I think, I'm not going to make an effort to try to avoid it because it's so ingrained in
Right.
everyday language that it just takes too much effort to train oneself out of it. So whenever I use the word seem there, it's I don't think of it a as some kind of epistemic justifier.
Mm.
So it has to be translated into an inference for it to do any justificatory work. I mean, there are seemings that do justify, right? As I've said, right? Like, well, maybe I didn't make this clear. Um, I do think seemings do inferentially justify, right? Because here's a way a seeming inferentially justifies. The hypothesis that there's a tree outside my window generates the expectation that when I look out my window, there should seem to be a tree there. I look outside my window and there seems to be a tree there. That's confirmation, however weak, right? That's confirmation of the tree hypothesis, the tree outside my window hypothesis, right? And so I have some inferential justification for my belief that there's a tree out there because there seems to be one. But that's an inferential appeal, right? And that's not presumably what opponents of phenomenal conservatism are talking about, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I apologize for not being able to eliminate um, the seeming talk. It's very hard to do. So hopefully, if you decide to publish this, viewers or hearers will be able to perform the operations of and disentangling either disentangling the seeming talk or retranslating it or supplying the missing inferences, whatever.
Yeah. I guess one more thing I was thinking about there, just when you were talking about like, how common, in what common parlance the seeming talk is used, is another thing of like, um, another thing that's kind of in a similar situation is the phrase should, like I should do this, I should do that, or even just like expectational shoulds, like I should, the train should be here about now, or like I should help my brother, but I don't want to. Like, what do you take should to mean actually?
Sorry, what was the example? What were the examples you gave?
Oh, like if I say like you should do this, you should do that, or if I have like general statements of expectation, like, oh, the train should be here about now.
Okay, so the train should be here about now, I take to be non-normative language. Those are called predictive oughts
Oh,
in the
interesting.
literature, right? So the term ought has a variety of uses, right? I think it's often said, I think, actually, I think I have this written down somewhere. It's often there are four basic types. Um, right, predictive, prudential, legal, and moral. So I think predictive oughts are non-normative. They're just sort of saying what's like. They're basically a form of probabilistic reasoning, right? The train usually arrives at this time, and so given that, um, given that today is a day like any other day, the trains would be expected to run the same way. We would expect that this is the time they would arrive, right? Something like that. Or under these types of conditions, um, when people say it should rain today, right? When you observe this type of cloud cover, um, there's an expectation that um, rain will fall. So that I take to be non-normative. Um, Now, prudential oughts, I guess, are normative. Those are essentially hypothetical norms. So, like, um, so like, um, if I want to get to New Jersey as quickly as possible, I ought to take the train, um, rather than walk, because the train is faster, right? Now, some people think you can just cash that out in totally non-normative terms, right? Somebody like Lance Bush is going to have a view like that. And there are various error theorists about normativity, or error theorists about hypothetical norm, or anti-realism about normativity or hypothetical norms, who are going to say things, like Lance Bush says, all these things reduce to consistency relations, right? And that's kind of like, so in other words, I guess they must be understanding a statement like that to amount to just saying, what conduces to the realization. This is what conduces to the realization of X. Or doing X is what conduces to the realization of um, of aim A. Doing X is what conduces to the realization of aim A. What's the therefore? I don't know. I guess I haven't really thought about this in a while. I guess I'm not really clear on how you take the ought out exactly. But in any case, I don't share their view, because I think normativity is constitutive of agency and intentionality, and it's not reducible to mere descriptive propositions, right? So I just don't take that view. So I think prudential oughts are normative, but it's people who are sort of
But
like
you
a
think they are
limitivists.
objective, like a prudential ought, like that's something that exists independently of our own, like, you know, I guess expectations as people, as humans.
No, I'm not saying that it's external exactly. I it I'm saying I'm saying that it's in virtue of the fact that one aims to go to New Jersey that one ought to take the train.
Okay.
Right? I'm just saying that there is an irreducible ought there. You ought to take the train. Given it's kind of like you could think of it as a commitment, right? You could think of it as I think commitments are internal oughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an internal ought is just that I'm given that I'm committed to X, this is what I ought to do. It's a type of internal obligation, right? I'm not fulfilling what I'm committed to. Therefore, I ought to undertake self-corrective action. I failed in my aim. Therefore, I ought to take self-corrective action, and which will likely, which I judge to likely bring about realization of that aim, right? I think people like Lance Bush and people like what's that guy's name? Olson. There's a guy named Olson. What's his first name? I can look it up for you later. There's a famous normative error theorist named Olson. Bart Strumer. I think Strumer and Olson are like the most prominent normative error theorists. They're just going to want to deny that there's any real ought there. That ought language should be translated into some kind of consistency relations or some kind of descriptive statements, right? I don't think Richard Joyce has that view. I think Richard Joyce believes in hypothetical norms. He just rejects categorical norms. But anyway,
Yeah, that's what my understanding of Joyce is as well.
Yeah, but so I don't agree with the normative error theorists. I don't think you can be an anti-realist about normativity. I don't think that makes any sense. So I think prudential oughts are normative. Then there are legal oughts. And I don't really see how legal oughts are normative. You ought. I think of those as institutional norms. So I guess if you think institutional norms, well, yeah. So institutional norms are normative insofar as one has the desire to be in accord with the institution, right? So obviously somebody who doesn't care about the law doesn't necessarily have any reason to obey the law. I mean, they might have a reason as in the poisoned wine case, because they might regret it later, right? And when they find themselves in jail, right? But assuming that they don't care about the consequences, right? Because you could frame it in purely descriptive terms, right? You could say, if you don't pay your taxes on April 15th, then you will go to jail, right? And so obviously, then you have a prudential. If you don't want to go to jail, you have a prudential reason to pay your taxes, right? But the very fact that it's against the law only is going to have any normative force, in my view of normativity, if you have a prudential reason to be in accord with the law. So legal oughts just seem to be a type of institutional norm, and they're normative insofar as one has a prudential reason to be in accord with the law, right? And the fourth type of ought, at least according to this taxonomy, I guess you could ask, well, why are there not epistemic oughts as a fifth type, right? But I'm understanding epistemic oughts as a type of prudential norm, really, because, well, it could be a prudential norm, because it could be that you value the truth because the truth conduces to some other aim, right? That would be for it to be a prudential norm. I suppose you could think that it's a moral norm, right? If you thought that moral norms were distinctive, from other types of prudential norms. See, I don't think there's a real distinction. I think we talked about this last time. I don't think there's a real distinction between moral norm and prudential norms, right? I don't think there's like some clear category of the moral. We were talking a little bit about how it's sometimes useful to divide things into things that I care about to the point where I would prevent you from doing it, right?
Yeah.
Versus the things that I'm indifferent to. And I certainly think that necessarily to draw a line, you know,
Sorry,
to
you cut
draw
out for
kind
a
of,
lot of that. You said, I don't think that necessarily, and then a whole bunch cut out. So.
yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily anything unreasonable about trying to draw a line in a way. I just
Oh,
think that
okay.
it's not going to capture certain intuitions because I think some people feel like they have moral obligations to themselves. They have a moral obligation to like not waste their lives or something like that, right? Like maybe if all you did was like stayed home and watched TV and smoked marijuana, that was all you did all day, you might feel like you were doing something morally wrong, even if you never
Well,
sort of
I
really did
certainly
anything.
don't.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, even
Oh,
if
I'm just
you
yeah.
never ended up helping anybody else, like, because you might think, well, it's just a waste of life to not actually do something valuable,
Yeah.
even if it's just for yourself, right? So you might think, I ought to do things like read Tolstoy or learn philosophy
Or watch a
or,
whole bunch of movies and end up in Cinemania.
yeah, you might think that those are ways of not wasting your life. And that watching like bad TV and, I mean, I'm sort of speaking a bit loosely here because I'm using kind of loaded language. That probably is,
I know what
um,
your view on TV is,
yeah.
Jack.
But I'm just saying, like, obviously, if it's bad TV, it's constitutively a waste, right?
Right.
Um, but at least in one sense of bad. But the basic point is just that maybe that's like some people would say, well, that's a moral obligation that one has to oneself, right? So I don't really think there is a fundamental distinction between moral oughts or any other kind of oughts. Really, all there are basically prudential oughts. Epistemic oughts are a type of prudential ought. Um, Maybe aesthetic norms, aesthetic values might be thought of as distinctive, um, in the sense that you um, you might think you have a reason. Let's say you're an artist, you might think that you have a reason to undertake some given artistic decision, right? And you might think, well, it's because it conduces to beauty, right? Conduces to the creation of a beautiful work of art, right? And so beauty you might think of as some kind of irreducible norm. But again, it just depends. Yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe somebody doesn't actually value beauty. That sounds a little bit like a contradiction. It seems like beauty is constitutively valuable, though it might be trumped by some competing values. But I guess beauty is supposed to be intrinsically valuable. And of course, beauty might be a relative notion, such that it's like I guess I think it would have to be fundamentally some type of relative notion because I don't think there could be like some categorical notion of beauty. Um, so it might be that people disagree as to what's beautiful. But if you do
I'm
think
curious.
it's something is
Do you
beautiful,
carry like particularism over to like aesthetic judgments as well?
oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so yeah. So I think ultimately it might be useful to talk about aesthetic value as distinct from other values, but ultimately, yeah. So I suppose it is, because I suppose something that's aesthetically valuable is just going to afford a reason, right, to value it. Because I guess there is a distinction here between an epistemic norm and an aesthetic norm, right? Because to believe something that's likely to be true does seem like, I'm sorry, to have a reason to believe something that's likely to be true does seem like it rests on a further norm of valuing truth, right? So it, you know, so if it's not the case that valuing truth is a constitutive feature of agency, as some would like to argue, um, then it would be the case that you could coherently disvalue truth, or be maybe even not disvalue it positively, but just be indifferent to truth, um, as some people clearly are, um, at least some of the time. But I guess beauty is a normative notion, unlike truth. Like, truth is not a normative notion, right? Um, but beauty is a normative notion. So I guess it's in something that's beautiful is inherent. One inherently ought to value beauty, all a beautiful thing, all else equal, right? Because beauty is a normative notion, whereas truth is not. So that's going to be a distinction. But in any case, you were asking about what are these shoulds, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I forget what example you gave, something like you should. What was the example you gave? Do you remember?
One of them was oh yeah, the main one was the train should be here by about now.
No, that one I already addressed. That's a
Okay,
predictive
the other
ought,
one was like,
and I
oh,
think is
I
not
think
normal.
the other one was like, oh, you should do this, he should do that, like,
Right. Well,
he should
so
help me
again,
out, right?
some people might think that they're invoking some kind of categorical norm
Okay.
in Mackey sense. If that's what they have in mind, uh, I don't think there are such things. I don't even think it's an intelligible concept. Um, I'm certainly not in possession of it, but I'm extremely doubtful that anybody is. Now, obviously, if they don't have a categorical norm in mind, then they're appealing to some prudential norm. And now it could be, given their aims, you ought to do X, but how does that afford a reason for you, right? Unless I have the desire to please you, it's like it doesn't necessarily afford me any reason that what I do, that my doing be is reason giving by your lights. So presumably they have to appeal to some value that I have.
Right.
You know, given that you want to go to New Jersey, you ought to take the train. Of course, they might not have a cognitivist view of that kind of, or cognitivist understanding in the background of that kind of language. Maybe they're just expressing their own emotions or attitudes. Um, that's, what non-cognitivists about moral utterances think is happening. They think I'm saying boo. If when I say rape is wrong, I'm just saying boo rape, something like that. And there's various other non-cognitivist theories. I mean, that's an emotivist view. People have offered other non-cognitivist proposals as to what's going on. So it could be some non-cognitivist. There could be some non-cognitivist construal of that kind of language. I think those would be the main options, right? They're either appealing to a categorical norm, they're appealing to a hypothetical norm that they have, which is not necessarily reason giving for you. They're appealing to a hypothetical norm you have, in which case it should be reason giving to you, or they're just not expressing something propositional to begin, but engage in some other kind of speech act that is disguised as a propositional claim.
Right. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, not on those questions.
Okay. Well, I don't really have anything else to ask for now. So, let me think though. Yeah, I can't really think of anything. So,
Okay.
so yeah. I mean, I won't keep you. I won't keep you much longer if there really isn't anything
Sure.
else, and I can't think of it. But thank you so much for your time, Jack. Really.
Oh, that's no problem.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I learned a
I
lot
mean,
today.
maybe this is used. Well, I mean, I guess it was good for me because I may have ended up reconstructing the. And I'm glad you have this recorded, because if I forget how I did, if I forget the two dilemmas that I came up with in thinking this through, I can just go and consult the
Yeah,
recording.
yeah.
So
I'll
please,
send you this
so
video.
please, if you don't publish it, just please send me the recording so
Yeah,
I can share it or
yeah, if I
refer
find
to it.
if it recorded properly, which is always just a risk, then
Right.
I'll know. Do you want to maybe reiterate what the dilemma you came up with was, just for the end of the video?
Well, there were two dilemmas. But now I'm trying to remember how to. So one dilemma was: is there an epistemic reason to be a phenomenal conservative?
Yeah.
And if they appeal to the fact that that phenomenal conservatism seems to be true, they're arguing in a circle. If they offer an inferential justification, no, I don't need that. If they, oh, I already think. Thank you. If they offer an inferential justification, then it seems like there's an inferential seemings confer justification inferentially, in which case they're not talking about non-inferential justification. Now, can I remember the other one? Now I really want to rewind. Now I really want to rewind the recording. Yeah. Well, why don't you let me know if the recordings come out, and if not, I'll try to. In the meantime, I'll try to see if I can remember that. Because it's eluding me right this minute.
Yeah. Well, no, this video seems to have come out, so when it's done, I'll just send it to you.
Yeah, send it to me, and then I'll get the timestamp. Yeah.
Cool.
I think that was probably valuable.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I really appreciate you, coming along for the talk. Because the funny thing is, we've known each other for like 3 years, but we've not actually talked that much directly. I think I just usually sent you like random little thoughts and vice versa, right? So.
Sounds right.
So yeah, so it's kind of awesome that you're willing to spare your time now to talk, especially when I've seen so many of your videos and debates. All right. Anyways, well, thanks so much for being on, Jack.
No problem.
Thanks. All right.
All right. See you later.
See you later.